I still remember the sound. Not the sound of my son opening the garage door, not the sound of his truck pulling away. The sound I remember is the empty silence that came after. The silence of a workshop that had been part of my life for more than 40 years. The silence that told me something was terribly wrong. When I stepped inside that garage, I froze. The wall that had once held dozens of tools was nearly empty. The wooden rack I built with my own hands looked like a skeleton. The workbench where I had spent thousands of hours stood bare. For a moment, I honestly thought I had walked into the wrong garage. Then I noticed the dust marks. Every missing tool had left behind a clean outline. Someone had taken them, all of them. And there was only one person who had access: my son. What he didn't know was that those tools were worth far more than money, and before this story was over, he would learn exactly why. But by then, it would be too late. My name is Harold Thompson. I'm 68 years old, and this is the story of how my own son sold something he never should have touched. At first glance, I probably looked like an ordinary retired man. I lived alone in a modest house. I drove an old pickup truck. I wore work boots almost every day. Most people assumed I didn't have much, including my son, especially my son. His name was Brian. Growing up, Brian wasn't a bad kid. At least that's what I used to tell myself. When he was little, he'd spend entire weekends with me in the workshop. I'd hand him small pieces of wood while I worked. He'd pretend to build things beside me. Those were some of the happiest years of my life. Back then, he loved the workshop. Back then, he respected it. But people change, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. After college, Brian became obsessed with appearances. New cars, expensive watches, designer clothes, everything became about looking successful. I tried not to judge him. Everyone finds their own path, but over time, something inside him changed. He stopped valuing hard work. He started valuing shortcuts, and shortcuts have a way of becoming habits. The first warning sign came years earlier. Brian borrowed money, then he borrowed more, then even more. Every time he promised it was temporary. Every time he promised he would pay it back. And every time another excuse appeared. I helped him because he was my son. That's what fathers do, or at least that's what I believed. Then came the failed business. Then the credit card debt. Then another business. Then another failure. No matter what happened, nothing was ever his fault. The economy, his partners, bad timing, bad luck. Everyone was responsible except him. Still, I never stopped hoping. Maybe that was my mistake. Maybe fathers hold on to hope longer than they should. 3 days before everything happened, Brian stopped by unexpectedly. He walked into the kitchen carrying a forced smile. "Dad," he said, "how have you been?" Whenever Brian started a conversation that way, it usually meant he wanted something. I poured him coffee anyway. We sat at the table. For a while he talked about random things, the weather, sports, traffic. Then he finally got to the point. "Dad, things are a little tight right now." Of course they were. They always were. I listened quietly. He explained another investment opportunity, another plan, another promise. And then came the question. "I just need $10,000. $10,000, like he was asking for a cup of sugar. I looked at him carefully. For the first time, I noticed something. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't ashamed. He expected it, as if my savings belonged to him, as if I existed to rescue him. When I told him no, his smile disappeared. The change was immediate, cold. Sharp, almost angry. "You have money," he said. "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" "The point is that you're asking me to solve problems you created." His jaw tightened. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he stood. "Fine." Just one word, fine, but there was nothing fine about the way he said it. As he left, I watched him through the window. Something felt different. Something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it. Not yet. 3 days later, I walked into the workshop and found it empty. And standing in that silence, I realized my instincts had been right. Something had happened. Something much bigger than stolen tools. And before long, I would discover a truth about my own son that hurt far more than any financial loss. Because those tools carried a secret I had protected for decades. A secret worth more than anyone imagined, including Brian, especially Brian. And now that secret was suddenly in danger. I stood in the empty workshop for nearly an hour. At first, I was angry. Then disappointed. Then something worse. Heartbroken. Most people would have looked at those missing tools and seen metal, wood, and equipment. I saw memories. Every scratch had a story. Every dent had a reason. That old hammer hanging near the window had helped me build my first house. The hand plane on the shelf had belonged to my father. Some of those tools were older than my son. And now they were gone. I wanted to believe there was another explanation. Maybe Brian moved them. Maybe he borrowed them. Maybe there had been a misunderstanding. But deep down, I already knew the truth. I walked into the house and checked the security camera footage. The workshop camera had been installed years earlier after a series of neighborhood break-ins. I rarely looked at the recordings. That day I watched every second. At exactly 2:14 in the afternoon, Brian's truck appeared in the driveway. My stomach tightened. He stepped out carrying empty storage bins. He looked around, then he unlocked the workshop. Over the next 2 hours, he loaded tool after tool into his truck. No hesitation, no guilt, no phone call. No permission. When he finished, he drove away. That was it. The evidence was undeniable. My own son had stolen from me. I sat there staring at the screen long after the video ended. I wasn't shocked anymore, just tired. The kind of tired that reaches your bones. The kind that comes from realizing someone you love isn't the person you believed they were. That evening I called him. The phone rang 4 times, then he answered. "Hey, Dad." His voice sounded normal, almost cheerful. "Where are my tools?" Silence, a long silence, then he sighed. "I was going to tell you." "No, you weren't." Another silence. Finally he spoke. "I needed money. So you stole from me?" "Come on, Dad, don't make it sound dramatic." "Don't make it sound dramatic." Those words hit harder than I expected. As if I was the problem, as if I was overreacting. "You took property that didn't belong to you? I'll replace them." "You can't replace them. They're just tools." That sentence told me everything. They're just tools. He truly didn't understand. He never had, and maybe that was my fault. Maybe I spent so many years protecting him from consequences that he never learned respect. "I want them back. They've already been sold." The words landed like a punch. Sold, gone, just like that. I closed my eyes. "Where? What? Where did you sell them?" At first he refused to answer. Eventually he gave me the name of a pawn shop on the other side of town. The next morning I drove there. The owner recognized the description immediately. "Large collection?" he asked. "Yes, older gentlemen's tools." "Yes," he nodded. "I remember." My heart sank. "What happened to them?" He pointed toward the back. "Most sold already. Most sold already." Those 3 words felt like losing my father all over again. The shop owner seemed to notice my expression. "You okay?" I forced a smile. "Not really." For the next 30 minutes he helped me identify what remained. Only a small portion was left. A few wrenches, several hand tools, 1 toolbox. Everything else had been purchased by collectors, contractors, and hobbyists, scattered across the county. Gone. As I prepared to leave, the owner stopped me. "Wait," he disappeared into a storage room. A moment later, he returned carrying something wrapped in cloth. "I almost forgot about this." My breath caught. I recognized it immediately. An old wooden box. The most important item in the entire workshop. The one thing I prayed Brian hadn't touched. For years it sat hidden on a shelf behind other equipment. Most people ignored it. Most people assumed it was empty. They were wrong, very wrong. The pawn shop owner placed it on the counter. "Your son sold this too." Slowly I removed the cloth. The familiar wood appeared beneath my hands. My father's initials were still carved into the lid. W.T. William Thompson, my father, the man who taught me everything. The man who started the secret that had remained hidden for nearly 70 years. The owner looked curious. "What is it?" I hesitated, then smiled. "Something my family should never have sold." He laughed politely. He thought I was talking about sentimental value. He had no idea. Nobody did, except me. I paid for the box and carried it back to my truck. The entire drive home, my thoughts raced. Brian had crossed a line, a serious line, but he still didn't know what he had nearly lost. The truth was hidden inside that wooden box, and if it had fallen into the wrong hands, everything could have changed. Not just for me, for the entire family. Back home, I carried the box into the workshop. The room looked emptier than ever, like part of its soul had been removed. I placed the box on the workbench. For several minutes, I simply stared at it. Memories flooded back. My father's voice, his lessons, the promise I made decades earlier, a promise I had never broken until now, because now the secret was no longer safe. Brian's actions had changed everything. The secret would have to come out, sooner than I planned. And when it did, my son would finally understand why those tools mattered, why I never sold them, why I protected them, and why his decision was about to become the biggest mistake of his life. Because hidden inside that workshop wasn't just family history, it was proof. Proof of something valuable, something powerful, something Brian had spent his entire life overlooking. The question was no longer whether he would learn the truth. The question was how much it would cost him when he did, and very soon that cost would begin to reveal itself. That night I didn't sleep. I sat alone in the workshop with the old wooden box resting on the workbench. The same box my father had handed me 32 years earlier. The same box he told me to protect no matter what happened. Back then I was 36 years old. My father was nearing the end of his life. I remember sitting beside his hospital bed when he called me closer. His voice was weak, but his eyes were serious. "Harold," he said, "there's something I need you to keep safe." I thought he was talking about money or property. Instead, he told me a story that began long before I was born. A story almost nobody knew, and a story my son was now dangerously close to destroying. I slowly opened the wooden box. Inside were several yellowed envelopes, old photographs, documents, letters, and one small metal key. The key was the reason everything mattered. The key opened a safety deposit box at a local bank, a box that had remained untouched for decades. Most people would assume it contained money. They would be wrong. Its contents were worth far more than money. My father had spent his entire life collecting proof of something extraordinary. Something our family helped create many years ago. A business, not a giant corporation, not a billion-dollar empire, but a company that quietly grew into something valuable, very valuable. The problem was that ownership records from decades earlier were complicated, very complicated. Most of the original partners had passed away, records had been lost, documents disappeared. And over time, many people forgot the company's true origins, except my father. He kept copies of everything, every agreement, every signature, every record, every piece of proof. And when he passed away, those records became my responsibility. For decades, I protected them. Not because I expected a reward, because I made a promise to my father. The next morning, I drove to the bank. The manager greeted me immediately. We had known each other for years. "Mr. Thompson, good morning. You haven't accessed that box in a long time." "No," I replied. "Today seemed like the right day." A few minutes later, I sat alone in a private room. The safety deposit box rested in front of me. Slowly, I inserted the key. The lock clicked. Inside sat dozens of carefully organized documents. Everything was exactly where I left it, thank goodness. For the first time in days, I felt relief. Brian hadn't found these, at least not yet. As I reviewed the contents, something caught my attention. A recent letter. I frowned. I didn't remember receiving it. The envelope had been forwarded by my attorney months earlier. Apparently, I had overlooked it. I opened it carefully. Within seconds, my pulse quickened. The letter came from a legal firm representing the company my father once helped build. The company now operated in 3 states, thousands of employees, millions in annual revenue. I continued reading. Then I read it again and again. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. The company was conducting a historical ownership review, an internal investigation. They were attempting to verify original ownership records dating back decades. My hands trembled, because sitting inside that deposit box was enough documentation to answer every question they had. Documentation nobody else possessed, at least not that I knew of. Suddenly, the situation felt very different. The secret wasn't just family history anymore. It was current, relevant, important. For the first time, I realized just how valuable those papers might become. Not because they guaranteed money, because they represented truth. And truth often matters when powerful decisions are being made. I left the bank carrying copies of several documents. On the drive home, my phone rang. "Brian." I considered ignoring it. Instead, I answered, "What, Dad, we need to talk?" His tone was different, nervous, concerned, interesting. "What about? There are some people looking for you." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "What people? I don't know." "Then how do you know they're looking for me?" "They came to my house." My stomach tightened. "What did they want?" "They asked questions about Grandpa." Now I was fully alert, questions about Grandpa, questions about my father, questions connected to the documents. The timing couldn't be coincidence, not anymore. What exactly did they ask? Brian hesitated. They wanted to know if you still had certain records. I remained silent. They said those records could be important. Important. That was one way to describe them. I suddenly realized something. Someone else was searching. Someone else knew the documents existed. And if they were asking Brian questions, they might know far more than I assumed. When did this happen? Yesterday. Why didn't you tell me? Another pause. I didn't think it mattered. Of course he didn't. For years, Brian ignored anything that wasn't immediately useful to him, but now things were changing, and I could hear it in his voice. For the first time, uncertainty had entered the conversation. Before hanging up, he asked a question. Dad, was there something special about those tools? I looked through the windshield. The road stretched ahead. For a moment, I almost told him everything. Almost, but he wasn't ready, not yet. Yes, like what? You'll find out soon enough. Then I ended the call. That evening, I contacted my attorney. His name was Richard Barnes. We had worked together for nearly 20 years. After reviewing copies of the documents, he grew unusually quiet. Finally, he looked up. Harold, do you understand what these are? I have an idea. No, he said carefully. I don't think you do. I leaned forward. What do you mean? Richard removed his glasses. If these records are verified, they could change several important legal assumptions. The room suddenly felt smaller. How important? He paused, then delivered a sentence I will never forget. Important enough that some people may become very interested in finding them. For several seconds, neither of us spoke, because we both understood the implication. This was bigger than family drama. Bigger than stolen tools. Bigger than Brian. The secret my father protected for decades was finally coming into the light, and once it did, there would be no turning back. What I didn't know was that Brian had already made another mistake, a much bigger mistake. One that would soon put him directly in the path of people who cared far more about those documents than he ever imagined. And when that happened, the consequences would change his life forever. The next week felt strange. For years, my life had been predictable. I woke up early, worked around the house, spent time in the workshop, enjoyed the quiet. But now everything felt different. The secret my father protected for decades was moving. Pieces were shifting. Questions were being asked. And somehow my son had placed himself directly in the middle of it. 3 days after meeting with Richard, I received another call from Brian. This time he sounded desperate, not nervous, not worried, desperate. Dad, can you meet me? I looked at the clock. It was nearly 9 at night. What's wrong? Please, just meet me. His voice immediately told me something was very wrong. An hour later, I pulled into a small diner near the highway. Brian was already there. The moment I saw him, I knew he looked exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes, wrinkled clothes, constantly checking his phone. He wasn't sleeping. And whatever was happening had been happening for a while. I sat across from him. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, he leaned forward. I need help. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because I had heard those exact words countless times before. The difference was that this time I wasn't interested in rescuing him. How much? His eyes widened. How did you know? Because that's usually why you call. He looked down, then quietly answered, 50,000. For a moment, I thought I heard him wrong. $50,000, he nodded. I sat back in my chair. The amount alone was shocking, but what shocked me more was how quickly he said it, as if $50,000 was a normal problem. As if everyone had that kind of money sitting around. What happened? At first, he gave the usual answers, bad investment, business setback, temporary problem. I interrupted him. No, what? Tell me the truth. He looked away. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then the real story began. About a year earlier, Brian had started borrowing money, not from banks. Not from investors, private lenders, people who charged huge fees, people who didn't enjoy being ignored. One bad decision became another, then another. Soon he was borrowing money just to cover previous debts. The hole kept growing, and now it had become impossible to hide. As he spoke, I realized something. This wasn't a temporary problem. This was years of bad choices finally arriving at his doorstep. Why didn't you tell me? His laugh was bitter. Because I knew what you'd say. And what would I say? The truth. At least he was honest about that for the first time in years. Then he asked the question I knew was coming. Can you help me? I stared at him. This wasn't easy. He was still my son. Part of me wanted to solve the problem. Part of me wanted to protect him. That's what fathers do. But another part of me knew something important. Every time I rescued Brian, I delayed a lesson he desperately needed to learn. No, his face hardened. What? No, he blinked. Almost like he couldn't believe the word existed. You have money. There it is again. What? You think my money belongs to you? His jaw tightened. You'd let your own son fail? No, I leaned forward. I'd let my son face the consequences of his choices. The words hit him harder than I expected. For a moment, he looked angry. Then something surprising happened. The anger disappeared, and underneath it, I saw fear, real fear, the kind that couldn't be hidden anymore, because deep down, Brian finally understood something. I wasn't coming to save him, not this time. When we left the diner, he looked smaller somehow, not physically, emotionally, like reality had finally started catching up. I wish I could say that conversation changed him immediately. It didn't. In fact, things got worse, much worse. 2 days later, Richard called. Harold, we need to talk. His voice was serious. What happened? I received another inquiry about the documents. I stopped what I was doing. From who? A private investigation firm? That got my attention. Why would investigators care? Because someone hired them. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. Someone was actively searching, not casually asking questions, searching. The company ownership review was becoming bigger than anyone expected, and apparently multiple parties were interested in the outcome. Then Richard said something alarming. They've already spoken to Brian. I froze. What? They contacted him yesterday. Immediately I understood the danger. Brian loved quick money, shortcuts, easy opportunities. If someone offered him cash for information, he might talk. He might talk a lot. That evening I drove directly to his house. When he opened the door, I got straight to the point. Who came here? His expression changed instantly. Wrong question, wrong reaction. He knew exactly what I was talking about. Nobody. Don't lie. For several seconds we stared at each other. Then he sighed. 2 men. What did they want? They asked about Grandpa. What did you tell them? Nothing important. The answer came too fast, way too fast. What did you tell them? This time his eyes dropped, and that was all the answer I needed. He had talked, maybe not everything, but enough. I walked into the living room. Brian followed behind me. They offered money, didn't they? Silence. They offered money. More silence. Finally he nodded. I closed my eyes. Of course they had, and of course he accepted. Because Brian had spent his entire adult life choosing immediate rewards over long-term consequences. How much? A few thousand. A few $1,000s. He sold information about family history for a few $1,000s. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so painful. What exactly did you tell them? I mentioned the workshop. My heart sank. What else? The wooden box. I felt all the air leave my lungs. The wooden box. The one thing I never wanted strangers hearing about. The one clue connecting everything. Brian suddenly realized how serious I was. His confidence disappeared. Dad. What is going on? I looked at him carefully. For years, I protected him from reality. For years, I carried burdens he never even knew existed. But those days were ending. Very soon, the truth would come out. And when it did, Brian would finally understand why some things should never be sold. Why some things matter more than money. And why the old tools he casually traded for cash were connected to something far larger than he imagined. Because at that very moment, a meeting was being arranged. A meeting involving company executives, attorneys, investigators, and the forgotten documents my father spent decades protecting. The truth was finally approaching, fast. And for the first time in his life, Brian was about to discover that every shortcut comes with a price he would soon be forced to pay. The following Monday, I walked into a conference room I never expected to see. For most of my life, I avoided boardrooms. I preferred workshops, sawdust, tools, real work. But now I found myself sitting across from attorneys, executives, and financial experts, and all because of a promise my father made decades ago. Richard sat beside me. Several company representatives sat across the table. Folders covered nearly every surface. The atmosphere felt tense, serious, like everyone understood something important was about to happen. One executive finally broke the silence. Mr. Thompson, thank you for meeting with us. I nodded. We appreciate your time. I didn't respond immediately. I wanted answers first. For weeks, people had been searching for records, asking questions, contacting my son, digging into the past. I wanted to know why. The executive opened a folder. Inside were copies of old documents. Some looked familiar, others did not. Then he said something that changed everything. "Your father was one of the original founders." The room became completely silent. I already knew my father helped build the company, but hearing someone officially confirm it felt different, much different. The executive continued. "Over the years, ownership records became incomplete." Richard glanced toward me. The executive continued speaking. "During our historical review, we discovered several discrepancies. A polite word for a very large problem. The company had spent months trying to reconstruct its history, but one crucial piece had been missing: the original partnership agreements. The exact documents sitting in my safety deposit box. The documents my father protected. The documents Brian nearly exposed." The executive looked directly at me. "We believe you possess the only surviving copies." I nodded slowly. "I do." Every person at the table seemed relieved, like they had finally found something they'd been searching for. Then came the real surprise. The executive opened another folder. Inside was a proposal, a very serious proposal, one involving ownership recognition, compensation, historical correction, and several legal matters that stretched back decades. I stared at the pages. For several moments, I couldn't speak. The numbers alone were difficult to process. Not because they made me wealthy overnight, because they represented something bigger: recognition, proof, validation. The truth my father spent his entire life preserving. For years, people forgot his contribution, forgot his sacrifices, forgot the role he played. Now that was changing, finally. As the meeting ended, one executive stopped me. "Your father should be remembered." Simple words, but they hit me harder than any financial offer ever could, because that was always the point: not money, respect, truth, legacy. When I returned home that evening, I found Brian sitting on my porch, waiting. The moment he stood, I knew something had happened again. "What now?" His face looked pale, worried, almost frightened. "Dad, I made a mistake." I nearly laughed. That sentence described half his life, but this time felt different. "Which mistake?" The men who were asking questions. I remained silent. "They came back." My stomach tightened. "What did they want?" His answer came quietly. "They wanted more information." Of course they did. People searching for valuable information rarely stop after one conversation. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing." I studied his face. For once I believed him. He wasn't lying, he was scared. And fear was something Brian wasn't very good at hiding. "They weren't happy." That got my attention. "What do you mean?" "They expected more." Suddenly I understood. The people chasing the documents believed Brian could help them, and now he couldn't, which made him useless. For the first time in years, my son was learning something important. Short-term decisions create long-term problems, a lesson he should have learned long ago. Brian sat down heavily. "I didn't know." "No, you never told me," I sighed. Would it have mattered? The question hit him hard, because deep down we both knew the answer: probably not. 10 years earlier, he wouldn't have listened. 5 years earlier, he wouldn't have cared. Even 1 month earlier, he probably would have ignored me, because money always seemed more important than wisdom, more important than family history, more important than consequences. Until consequences arrived. Then suddenly wisdom mattered, a lot. That night after Brian left, I walked into the workshop. The room still felt empty. Many tools remained missing. Many would never return. But for the first time since everything began, I felt something unexpected. Peace. Not complete peace, but enough, because the truth was finally coming out. And the truth has a way of settling old debts. I stopped in front of the workbench. The wooden box rested exactly where I left it. I placed my hand on the lid, then smiled. My father had been right. All those years ago, he understood something I only fully appreciated now. Some people inherit money. Some people inherit property, but the most valuable inheritance is wisdom. And unfortunately, wisdom usually arrives after mistakes, very expensive mistakes. The next morning, Richard called again. This time his voice sounded excited. "Harold, good morning. I received confirmation." "Confirmation of what?" A brief pause followed. Then came the sentence that changed the future. "The company has officially recognized your father's contribution." I sat down immediately. After all these years, after decades, after being forgotten, the truth had finally won. But while I was celebrating that victory, another situation was quietly unfolding. A situation involving Brian, his debts, the people he owed, and a decision he was about to make. A decision that would either destroy the little trust we had left, or finally force him to become the man I always hoped he could be. The choice was now his. And for the first time in his life, nobody could make it for him. I knew something was coming before it even arrived, not because I had evidence, but because life has a way of tightening the circle before the final moment. Brian stopped calling. That was the first sign. Then the silence became uncomfortable. Then it became suspicious. For a man who used to call whenever he was in trouble, suddenly disappearing meant only one thing. The trouble had found him. 3 days passed without a word. On the 4th day, I saw his truck outside my house. It wasn't parked properly. It was angled, rushed, like he had arrived in a hurry and didn't care how it looked. Brian stepped out immediately when I opened the door. He wasn't alone. 2 men stood a few feet behind him. I didn't like them the moment I saw them, not because of how they looked, but because of how they stood, confident, patient. The kind of patience that comes from knowing you already have control of a situation. Brian walked toward me quickly. "Dad, we need to talk inside." I didn't move. "Who are they?" His voice dropped. "Please." That was all he said. The 2 men stayed outside. Brian led me into the living room. The moment the door closed, everything changed. He wasn't my son in that moment. He was someone cornered, someone running out of options. "They're not good people," he said. "I figured that part out already." He rubbed his face. "I messed up again." I didn't respond, because I already knew this wasn't the same kind of mistake as before. This one had weight. Real consequences. "I told them I could get more information," he admitted. My chest tightened slightly. "About what?" "The documents." I closed my eyes. Of course, the same documents. The same secret, the same chain of decisions pulling him deeper. "They gave me money up front," he continued, "and now they want results." "How much?" He hesitated. "More than before." That told me everything. When people increase pressure, it means time is running out. "What did you tell them this time?" Brian looked at the floor. "I told them you might still have access to everything." I didn't react immediately, because I had reached a point where anger no longer came first. Only understanding, slow, painful understanding. "You sent them here," I said quietly. "No, I didn't send them. They followed me." "That's not the same thing." He didn't answer because I was right, and he knew it. For the first time, I saw something new in Brian's eyes. Not arrogance, not entitlement, regret. Real regret. But regret doesn't fix problems. It only arrives after they've grown too large. "What do they want now?" I asked. Brian swallowed hard. "They want the box." The workshop felt like it had suddenly become colder. That box again, the one thing I had protected for decades. The one thing that tied everything together. I nodded slowly. "Did you tell them where it is?" "No," a pause, "but they think I know." That was worse, far worse. Because belief drives action more than truth ever does. Outside, I heard movement. The 2 men were still there, waiting, watching. I walked to the window. One of them was speaking quietly on the phone. The other was scanning the property, not casually, professionally. These were not men who gave up easily. I turned back to Brian. "This is bigger than you understand," I said. He laughed weakly. "I understand I'm in trouble." "No," I replied. "You understand fear. That's different." That stopped him. For a moment, he just stared at me. Then he asked something I had been expecting for a long time. "Dad, what is in that box?" I didn't answer immediately. Because this was the moment I had been avoiding for years. The moment truth stops being protection and becomes responsibility. Before I could speak, a knock came at the door. Sharp, direct. 3 knocks, then silence. Brian froze, the color drained from his face. "They shouldn't be here yet," he whispered. Another knock, this time louder. I walked toward the door slowly. Brian grabbed my arm. "Don't open it." I looked at him. For the first time, I saw something in him that resembled his childhood self, the boy who used to help me in the workshop. The boy who believed in safety, in trust, in family, but that boy had disappeared a long time ago. I gently removed his hand, then opened the door. The 2 men were standing there. One smiled politely, the other didn't smile at all. "Mr. Thompson," the first one said, "we need to talk." I stepped outside slightly. "About what?" "The documents." I nodded. "I assumed so." the second man spoke for the first time. "We believe you're holding something that belongs to a wider agreement." "Belief is not proof," I replied. A small silence followed. Then the first man smiled again. "That's why we're here, to make things clear." Behind me, I heard Brian move closer. The man's eyes shifted briefly toward him, then back to me. "We think your son already explained the situation." I didn't look back, but I felt Brian's presence behind me, small, tense, regretful. "I think my son explained part of it," I said. The man nodded. "That's enough for now." And in that moment, I understood something important. This was no longer about family mistakes. This was about pressure, interest, and people who did not like unanswered questions. They stepped back slightly. "We'll be in touch again," the first man said. Then they left, no threats, no shouting, just certainty. The worst kind of presence. When the door closed, Brian exhaled heavily. "What do we do now?" he asked. I turned to him slowly. For a long moment, I said nothing, because the answer had been forming for a long time. Finally, I spoke. "Now you stop running," he frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means you're done selling pieces of this story for money." He looked confused. I didn't know what I was getting into. "No," I said. "But you kept going after you knew." Silence filled the room, heavy silence. Then I walked past him toward the workshop. "I need to prepare something," I said. "For what?" "For the end of this." Brian followed me slowly. "Is this dangerous?" I stopped at the workshop door, looked at him, and finally told him the truth he had been avoiding his entire life. Yes, that single word changed everything. Because now, for the first time, Brian understood that this was no longer about tools. It was about a legacy. And the price of legacy is always higher than anyone expects. Far higher than stolen metal, far higher than borrowed money, and far higher than regret. The final chapter was now beginning. And this time there would be no shortcuts left to take. That night I didn't sleep at all. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in years. I prepared everything, not for war, not for revenge, but for truth. The wooden box sat open on my workbench. Inside it, every document was now carefully organized. Every page checked, every signature verified, every connection confirmed. What I had always suspected was no longer just history, it was official. My father hadn't just helped build a company. He had helped shape its foundation in a way that was legally significant even today. And that meant something very important. This wasn't just family legacy anymore. This was responsibility. The next morning, Richard arrived earlier than expected. He looked serious, but controlled. "Harold," he said, sitting down, "this is moving faster than we thought." I nodded. "I know." He placed a thick folder on the table. "They're preparing to finalize the ownership review." I looked at the folder. "And Brian," Richard hesitated. "That's part of why I'm here." My stomach tightened slightly. "He's been contacted again." I closed my eyes. Of course he had. Because people like Brian always get pulled back in when pressure increases. "Did he say anything else?" Richard adjusted his glasses. "He tried to sell them something." I slowly looked up. "What?" "He offered to provide access to the box." The room went silent, not because I was surprised, but because I finally understood the final piece of the pattern. Brian wasn't just making mistakes anymore. He was trading truth for survival, and that always ends the same way. Richard continued. "They stopped taking him seriously." That part didn't surprise me. Because people who chase real power don't respect desperation, only value, and Brian had run out of value. Later that afternoon, I asked him to come to the workshop. When he arrived, he didn't look like my son anymore. He looked like a man who had finally reached the edge of everything. "I messed everything up," he said immediately. I didn't respond. Because this time he was right. He sat down heavily. "They cut me off," he said. "I know." He looked at me. "You knew this would happen?" "No." A pause. "I knew what kind of choices you were making." Silence. Long silence. Then he asked the question I had been waiting for since this began. "What is in that box?" I walked over and placed it in front of him. For a moment I didn't speak. Then I opened it fully. I handed him the documents. "Read." At first he looked confused. Then slowly he began to understand. Names, agreements, ownership history, legal structures, connections he never knew existed, and finally the scale. The real scale of what his grandfather had been part of. His expression changed gradually. Confusion, shock, then disbelief. This is real?" he asked. "Yes." He looked up. "And people have been looking for this?" "Yes." His voice dropped. Because it's valuable, I shook my head. No, that confused him. Then why? I closed the box gently. Because it's proof, he stared at me. Proof of what? I took a slow breath. Of who we are and who we were always meant to be. For a long moment he said nothing. Then his shoulders dropped. All at once, like something inside him finally gave up. I sold your tools, he said quietly. Yes, for nothing. I looked at him. No, I said, you sold them for a lesson, he laughed weakly. A very expensive lesson, I nodded. The most expensive kind. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. The world felt still, not peaceful, but final. Brian spoke again. What happens now? I looked at the box. Now the truth goes where it belongs. And me? I turned to him. For a long time I didn't answer, because this wasn't just about punishment. It was about understanding. Finally I spoke. You stopped chasing shortcuts, he nodded slowly. I don't know how. That's the first honest thing you've said. A faint, broken smile appeared on his face. For the first time in a long time, I saw not the man he had become, but the boy he used to be. Later that week, everything moved quickly. The company finalized its review. My father's contribution was officially recognized. The documents were secured, the legal matters resolved, and the missing history was restored. As for the people who were searching, they got what they needed, not through pressure, not through manipulation, but through truth. And Brian, he disappeared for a few days. When he returned, he wasn't the same, not fixed, not perfect. But quieter, slower, more aware. One evening he sat beside me in the workshop. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then he finally said, I didn't understand what you were protecting. I nodded. I know, I think I understand a little now. That's enough for today. He looked around the workshop, at the empty spaces, at the missing tools, at the history still hanging in the air. I'm sorry, he said, and this time it didn't sound like a request. It sounded like understanding. I placed the wooden box back on the shelf where it belonged. Then I looked at my son. Some things can be replaced, I said. Others can't, he nodded. I know. And for the first time in a long time, I believed he did. Not everything valuable looks expensive, but everything meaningful has a price when it is lost. Respect, trust, and honesty cannot be replaced like money or tools. And sometimes, life doesn't punish you immediately. It waits until the lesson becomes impossible to ignore. Thank you for watching this video. If this story touched you, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more emotional revenge and betrayal stories. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next story. And tell me in the comments, what should the father do next in the next episode?